Hi, everybody, and welcome to the discussion of the Big Gay Read this year, Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Malinda Lo, with two of our friends from Everwell Counseling. How about you guys introduce yourself?
Okay. Well, hi, I'm Dr. Jennifer Tang. You can call me Jennifer. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm the director of Everwell Health and Counseling, where I practice here in Ann Arbor, but also servicing anyone remotely throughout the state of Michigan. And our mission is to provide diversity affirming care that's culturally responsive, but also rooted in using research-backed, evidence-based supported therapy practices.
Hi, I'm Nicola. I'm also a therapist at Everwell, and I also am a therapist at a nonprofit here in town that provides mental health services, the Women's Center of Southeastern Michigan. And in my former life, I was an academic psychologist. My research actually focused on issues related to identity and social justice. And then I guess what feels relevant for today is I grew up in San Francisco, and I most recently moved here from Oakland, just across the bay. And I'm also an immigrant. I'm what's called 1.5 generation. So, folks who moved here between 6 and 12. And so I was really excited to read the book, and I'm so excited to be a part of this conversation.
Oh, that's all wonderful. That context is incredible. And my name is Jacob. I am an employee at Ann Arbor District Library, where I work in the outreach department. A little bit about the book. The book centers around Lily. It's set in 1954, San Francisco, Chinatown. And the book follows Lily as she comes to terms with certain parts of her identity, as she falls in love for the first time. So much happens in this book, and rather than summarizing it, I'd love to dive in with you guys. Now, Lily is the child of immigrants. She is Chinese. She's a young woman who is attracted to other women. There's a lot, the intersections of her identity are aplenty, so to say. I was hoping we could talk a little bit about intersectionality and maybe how we see it in the book.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about intersectionality, because I do think that it's becoming more popularly used, even outside of our professional spheres. I hear a lot of people just even talking about my intersecting identities, et cetera. So yeah, I think kind of on a broader level, the way I like to think about it is it just gives us a fuller picture of better understanding who each of us are, and also how society kind of perceives us. And I guess from a more technical level, it's really about kind of the different ways our lived experiences, whether it's our social location, our different identities, our different relationships with others around us, and how then we're kind of impacted by different levels and intersecting levels of power and privilege versus disadvantage and oppression. And so that could be kind of lots of factors like racial identity, ethnic identity, gender identity, sexual orientation, able-bodyism, or social economic status, religion, nationality, neurodiversity, et cetera, et cetera. So so I think kind of as a quick example of that, right? For we're talking about Chinese American female, right, versus a Chinese American male, there might be some similar experiences, and there's also going to be some different experiences, right? A white female might have some similarities and some differences from that Chinese American female. If you're a cisgender Asian American female, might have some similarities and then some differences from a transgender Asian female. So it just helps us better understand kind of these nuances.
Yeah, I think, one of the things I also kind of was thinking about, and Jennifer and I talked about this as I was reflecting on Lily's experience in the book, was this idea of intersectional invisibility. And so I'll just sort of unpack that. It basically describes this phenomena. So for some people, right, if you exist at these different intersections, you can be rendered invisible, in part because you don't meet maybe people's what we call kind of prototypical ideas, right? So for example, if you ask people, and research actually shows this, if you ask people to imagine an American person, they will oftentimes imagine a white person, right? And so if we sort of think about this in the book, right, and we think about Lily's experiences when she's entering into these queer spaces, and I'll use the term queer for LGBTQ plus probably a lot here. But entering into these gay spaces really at the time, right? There's this assumption that all gay people are white. And so she's sort of encountering these moments where people are treating her, I think, with some surprise, or this idea, and she exists, this where like all Asian people or all Chinese people are straight. And so I think in those moments, I just, thinking about that and thinking about this with my clients, right? That kind of invisibility then can be really lonely, right? You're kind of constantly feeling like an outsider. You're not quite anybody's sort of stereotypical idea of any of these groups that you belong to. And so I think that's kind of another way in which we see intersectionality show up in the book. And that I think really, as I was reading it, like resonated with a lot of experiences clients bring to us. And
something really powerful I found in the book, speaking about this invisibility or this loneliness, is when she finds the lesbian pulp novels in the pharmacy. And she's like attracted to them in this really magnetic way. And I think for a lot of queer people, we have these moments where it's like, oh, that's something like me.
yeah.
And as young people, it's like we sink our fangs into it, and really, it is such a reprieve almost. So what you had said reminded me of that particular moment.
Yeah. That's such a poignant moment, because she suddenly makes sense to herself, right? In this way that, like, oh my gosh, all of these experiences I've been having, or these thoughts I've been having, I see this it talks to the importance of representation, but also like how suddenly, I love that, like all these things click for her. And I think probably, LGBTQ plus or not, you can imagine that moment maybe if you felt invisible, when all of a sudden, like, oh wow, my experience has like a name or makes sense or is one that's shared. So yeah, so powerful.
Yeah, I love that. Actually, yeah, I was just thinking about, as you said, Nicola, I was like, this is why representation matters, just being able to find, the written word and having someone have these experiences that we can identify with. And so it feels a little bit meta to be talking about it, but I was like, this is why this book is so important, right? A lot of things I was reading about where so many people were like, I wish I had this book when I was in middle school, right? Just across all the things, LGBTQ representation. I mean, even just as Chinese American, I was like, what? There was like no stories about our lived experience beyond kind of very more exotic, ethnic type of thing. So yeah, I think it goes back to that theme of like how important representation is, and how poignant that moment is, and perhaps hopefully this book will be for their readers too.
Yes. Now, Nicola, I understand that you recently attended a training or like a professional development that reminded you of something from the book.
Oh, I think that was Jennifer.
Jennifer.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I was
And
gonna.
please keep talking. My cat's in a box. I'm just going to get him out of it.
No worries.
But please.
Love this.
Yes, I love it. I was just going to share this quick anecdote. It was actually a training about kind of how to work with immigrant clients as a mental health professional. But the presenter was kind of sharing their own personal identities, right? She's like, I'm an Asian, Indian, immigrant, lesbian, female. And so a common theme that she's kind of noticed amongst others who have shared multiple identities is the challenge of how to embrace these multiple identities, because there's all these themes of like, fear of safety, or questioning kind of acceptance versus rejection based on these identities. So I think that's kind of speaking back to the intersectionality theme, right? And then, the speaker also kind of shared kind of this quick anecdote where, or not even an anecdote, but just like something that's come up a lot, right? When she's taking a taxi or a Uber with her son, oftentimes, right, the driver will be like, your son's such a great kid. He must have a wonderful father. And how the woman was like, it's not for a lack of pride in my family or who I am, but also kind of like, is this a safe space, right? Like in terms of this considerations in this context, right? So I thought that was just interesting that she shared that.
Yes, and yeah, this speaks to this experience that queer people, we're always figuring out if we're safe, even from being very young as children. we figure out, you know, is this space for us off of such little data, if that makes any sense, based on so little of what's happening around us. Now, something that happens in the book that spoilers, if there's going to be spoilers, so get spoiled. But in the last third of the book, Lily actually comes out to her family, which was shocking for me because you don't imagine somebody in 1954 coming out to their family. But Lily is a special kind of person. I wanted to talk a little bit about the experience of coming out and see what both of you kind of had to say about that process.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the thing I sort of always start with is this question of how we come out to ourselves. And I think we actually just touched on that, right? Like that moment for Lily is in some ways like is when she finds this Pulp Fiction novel. And I think that's what makes it such a powerful moment. But, you know, we can't even think about coming out to other people in some ways, right? Until and of course, you hear stories all the time of people actually like being outed to themselves by other people, even like being recognized in this way. But that piece of it, like how do we make sense of ourselves, I think is such an important part of coming out. And again, speaks to this importance of representation, right? Like if there are no stories being told about you, how do you make sense of yourself? Or no stories being told about the kind of desire you have, or you know, whatever it might be. And so I think our internal experiences in some ways can be, it's not that the experiences themselves are like limited, but I think how we make sense of them and how we can talk about them is so limited by what we see. So, I mean, which is why like books like this are so powerful, right? And why they resonate so much, I think, with us, even if we might not have had all the same experiences. So that's sort of one piece. And then I think so much of like, I talk about this all the time, right? Like with clients about all kinds of coming out, but especially let's say around like gender identity or sexuality, which is that it's a journey. It's not just like this one moment in time. So where you end up, if you ever end up anywhere, might be really different than where you start. I think that's true for us in our own internal experience. And I also think it's really true for family and friends. And I find something that can be kind of comforting, right? So, you know, it's okay to reflect on and know your own boundaries, right? As family or friends might struggle with your coming out. But I think if you can hold in your minds that they too might be on a journey. And so a family that might be initially rejecting really may come to a very different place. Like if you can hang in there for that, that's wonderful. And if you can't, and some people can't for lots of reasons, like for their own mental health reasons, that's okay too. But I think that idea of that this is like not just this one moment, even though that coming out moment is so powerful, and I think we represent it in literature all the time, it is just a moment. And the whole process is a much longer process. And then just maybe like one final note on, I think like Jennifer and I were having this conversation too, right? There's a lot, I mean, we're here in Pride Month, right? Which is all about, in some ways, like being out and being proud. And that is so important. And again, I'm always like, even my clients notice them, I'm always like, let's look at the research, right? And research does show that for some people, concealing your identity is this kind of stress, right? It can have health consequences. But I also, and I think like there's this really kind of Western notion that we have, like it's really important to be out, and it's important to be out in every context and to be out in a particular way and to come out. And there's power in coming out. I never want to deny that. But I think we kind of create this hierarchy of like the most authentic way to be LGBTQ is to be out. And not everybody wants to be out. It's not important to everybody in the same way. It's not relevant to everybody in the same way. It's not safe, to Jennifer's point, right? Like that constant sort of like equation that people are doing to figure out, like, is this a safe space? And so I always really want to emphasize that, right? Like we do not want to impose this idea of outness or even what works for us on other people, in part because it's so complex. And I think for many people, like it's so culturally located. So, yeah.
Yes. No, I really like that you kind of even, and Nicola touched upon kind of like, there's even some cultural notions kind of embedded into like what that looks like, right? And I think that's such a good point because during this month, I've been reading kind of a lot of commentary on queer BIPOC therapists, kind of sharing some of their insights, both in their personal experiences and the work amongst their clients. And a couple of things that resonated with me was one was sharing, speaking of research, right? They said that actually research showcases that coming out in all contexts or doesn't actually equate to a higher level of happiness or well-being, right? What's more important is just kind of like your own internal harmony around that. And so that speaks to what Nicola was saying about how authenticity really matters based on the context, right? Like, how do we show up with our friends versus how do we show up with our coworkers? How do we show up with our siblings, and how that might show up with our parents, or how we show up in queer spaces, right? Like, there might be some similarities, but there might be some differences, and that's okay, right? That's kind of being like, how do we be authentic for ourselves? Right. And that it could also be a journey to what you were saying too, right? And then someone else had shared that, I thought was so important, right? Is that your identity is valid, basically, period, right? It's not about like how many people that you've come out to or shared this with, right? And they mentioned, right, like, you don't owe anyone else your truths, right? We don't expect that of other people in other contexts, right? You don't owe them to know your deepest truths if they haven't earned your trust. But that doesn't make you any less who you are, right? It's most important kind of how we see ourselves and how we affirm ourselves. That's important. So I thought those are important. I that was resonated with me, I guess. Yeah.
In response to what you had just said, Jennifer, I was recently asked, what is the library doing on National Coming Out Day? And my first kind of reaction was, I hope we're not doing anything. Because there's this pressure. And I think that when it comes to coming out, when it comes out to life in general, queer people could just use less pressure. And that's one viewpoint. I know other people view it differently, and shout out to them. Part of the book deals with race. It's 1954. And Lily's family has moved to America. And in San Francisco, they're experiencing racism. I wanted to talk about that with you guys and see your thoughts on how it's represented in the book and how we're seeing this kind of reverberate into our lives today.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jacob, for just bringing this up, right? I know sometimes it can be a touchy subject, right? And I think that in thinking of this, even our current day and age, right, we shall hopefully know and understand the kind of concept of racism as we see, especially reflected in kind of the time period of the book, right? Like during this period of what's called like the Red Scare in the US, there's a lot of worry about people being communist if they looked Asian. That kind of thing. And that's kind of what I would kind of identify as like overt racism, right? There's kind of like overt, like physical or verbal assaults, right? And we also see this now, right? Like right during like 2020, the COVID pandemic, right? Like there was a rise in hate sentiment, thinking like COVID was started in China, all that stuff. So overt racism would be those kinds of things where there's name calling, verbal attacks, physical attacks, et cetera, based on one's race, right? Someone shouting like, go back home, right? And someone's like, this is my home, right? But the implication is like, this is not your home. You don't belong here. But what's something else that's also a form of racism is called microaggressions. Some people may have been hearing the term a little bit more, but maybe it's less familiar for other folks. Microaggressions are what are seemingly subtle, sometimes often not intentional, but could also be pernicious in that way, right? A common one that's experienced amongst Asian Americans, right, might be someone being like, "Wow, your English is so good," or you wrote this article really well, right? You're a great writer. Even though it sounds like a compliment, it actually has the same undertones of that overt racism, right? It's the same theme of like, oh, I don't see you as belonging here, that this isn't your home, right? So that's one common theme of racism, particularly amongst Asian Americans, is this kind of seen as perpetual foreigners, right? And more so than maybe other racial groups. No one's going to be like, when did you come to this country? Well, my grandparents came, however long ago. And then another common theme amongst Asian Americans is what's called the model minority myth. And so in a quick, this could be a whole hour in itself, so I'll be quick, but in a nutshell, right, this is kind of this stereotype that Asian Americans are hardworking, law-abiding, they're academically successful, perhaps more financially successful, all of that. And sounds so lovely, right? Like, well, why is that a bad thing? Someone would ask. And what's problem with model minority myth is a lot of things, but quickly, one of which is like this concept of like model minority. Well, like, oh, well, our country's not racist because look at this racial group, right? Like they're not struggling in these financial spheres as maybe other racial groups are. So it's not a race thing, right? But that's really pitting groups against each other. And if I were to be bold to say, right, like that's just upholding white supremacy in that sense. Other ways in which model minorities can be model minority myth can be problematic is that we'll see in like affirmative action, right? Affirmative action is kind of created to be equitable, trying to get more folks being able to get into college. However, it definitely is a disadvantage for Asians. Just the other day, I was reading an article in the New York Times, right, in our day and age, where it said like how to get into college, how to appear less Asian is what I think the headline was, something to that effect. And because I think, again, as a racial category, right, they're like, look, like there are so many of them that are able to get into college, but as a race, especially amongst Asians, right? You think about the continent of Asia, it's so diverse. There's so many different languages, different kind of histories, very different kind of cultural norms and values, and all of that. So it's hard that, it's being kind of lumped together into one racial group. And then particularly here in the United States, right? What does that look like, right? Going back to the college example, right? It's like, well, if you look specifically at the subgroups, you'll see that like Asian Indian Americans, for example, as an ethnic group, 85% of them have a college degree. However, look at Cambodian American data, it will say there's like only 15% of Cambodian Americans in this country have a college education. So there's such a disparity. So when you're kind of lumping them together into one racial group, like, well, they're fine. Just because they check one box that they're Asian, we can either reject them from getting to college is disadvantaging them. So that's another example, that a common theme amongst Asian Americans. And then, a couple other quick ones. I think when it comes to racism, right, there's what's called the bamboo ceiling. I think some of us have heard of kind of like the glass ceiling, particularly for women. Bamboo ceiling is kind of a similar concept, right, that Asians are perceived as hardworking, right? Model minority myth. However, they're not seen as leadership material. So you'll see a lot of research and data that's saying that they're so oftentimes overlooked in terms of promotions in like the corporate world. And then, another theme is invisibility, right? I remember even as a student, like a researcher, we're talking about like different race and how that's being impacted by all these factors, but it so often didn't even include Asians as a category. So I thought that was interesting. So those are a couple of themes that I've seen, not only just even in that time period, right? Sometimes you'll think like, oh yeah, when I read it in this book, it's so overt, right? Like what happened to Lily's father, for example, and all of that. But I mean, like even in our present day, there's definitely themes of overt or covert racism.
Jennifer, when you were talking about the model minority myth, I was it reminded me of a semi-recent news story. In Florida, they had gutted African-American studies in AP programs. And then the next month, they are celebrating Asian American Pacific Islander Month. And they say, look at all the incredible AP classes that we offer concerning the history of Asian Americans in our country. And you go, that's wonderful. But then you go, oh no, I know what you're doing.
Okay.
It's this pitting against each other, or really what they're saying is, we want to boost your ego up while we keep these people down. And just to see, specifically to see white people use people of color to, dare I say, for evil is really difficult to see in 2023. So that's something that I had thought of listening to you.
Yeah, no, I so appreciate you bringing that up. I was going to bring in an example too. I wasn't sure I would be too political, but it's so true. Like I've seen even in like certain news circuits that are trying to kind of promote Asian American news, right? And they're saying like, you know, as much as we want to celebrate this, like we got to be cautious. Like this is not like they're not trying to be benevolent. Like look at us, we're trying to be inclusive and learn about Asian American history. It's like no, like look at just recently what this state has done in terms of oppressing other racial groups and their history. So no, I appreciate you bringing that up, Jacob, because again, we're looking at this in 2023, and this is happening just a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I think all this talk about you know, racism, I think it really us as mental health professionals, right? Like it really does see how the impact of racism impacts an individual in terms of like our sense of self and all of that. So I don't know, you know, Nicola had something that would be helpful to kind of share in relation to that, if you'd like.
No, I mean, I think you all just covered so much and so well. And I think like the mental health, right, effects of discrimination and racism are so well documented. And I think sort of connected to the ways in which like white supremacy uses, right, like pits BIPOC peoples against each other. I was thinking that sort of other, and if you'll indulge me at like a quote came to mind, something I think, again, like Jennifer and I were talking about, and this is something I talk about with clients in various ways and think about myself, is sort of like the deep cost, to the sort of cost of time and energy, and like the embodied cost of racism. And I don't know, it's like, I think you see that in bits and pieces in the book. And there was like this one moment, I think, where, and forgive me if I'm going to get the details wrong here, and it's not a spoiler really, but like Lily's mom is reflecting on this idea of kissing. And there's this like representation, I think, that like Chinese people don't kiss, like, and she's sort of thinking how silly that is. And it brought to mind this, I'm going to pull it up, this Toni Morrison quote that is basically about the sort of the cost, I think, of racism. So she sort of says, she's Toni Morrison, so she said it so much better than I ever could, right? Like the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language and you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the fact that it is. Somebody says you have no art, so you dredge that up. Somebody says you have no kingdoms, you dredge that up. None of this is necessary. There will always be one more thing. And I think that's so powerful, right? That racism is this, like, it is a distraction. I mean, it is a real lived, embodied evil. And also just like, but that we can see the way in which I think about, like, in clients' lives, that it shows up as this sort of constant needing to prove oneself, right? Even if you reject that idea, I think you end up engaging with it in various ways inevitably. And sort of that, the cost of that, I think, also points to the need for community, right? Like why it's so important then to have people who share your experience, or even if they don't understand from a lived perspective, that experience can acknowledge it. And so, but I think, there are like, one of the things that's so wonderful about the book too, is it shows the particularities of racism, right? Because it does show up in these different ways for different people. And it's based in 1950s. And yet, Jennifer, to your point, right? Like we're reliving those moments, that's everything that happened around COVID is like some new version of that kind of Red Scare, right? As it emerged within the, like, as we see in this sort of Chinese American enclave, but we can see that again nationally happening. And so that's what's so powerful about these, books that are supposedly about the past, and yet it's constantly.
Yeah, no, it's so true. I noticed, I mean, I feel like I didn't get my PhD that long ago, right? And I was like, we didn't even study a lot of this stuff then. And really, I think, even being in this field, right, I think a lot of these things didn't even really kind of come up to the surface of conversation for us, even until the last couple of years, right, during this pandemic and this kind of rise, right, there's probably some people that were doing the research before then, but it's going to be all the more kind of talked about, right, like the term of racial trauma. I really feel like I didn't really kind of hear about it until the last few years, right? I mean, you're kind of aware of the word trauma, right? You think about like a war veteran, right? They're kind of literally in life-threatening experiences and how they're kind of reliving these things, how it's impacting them. But kind of like what we're talking about, the effects of racism, right? Even again, our minds still think about like, well, if someone physically assaulted me or verbally assaulted me, that's kind of like how scarring is that. But really, there's also kind of like, to Nicola's a quote that she shared from Toni Morrison, right? Like just how the cost that it has on us, kind of an ongoing effects. And some of this kind of racial trauma mirrors similar kind of trauma symptoms in the sense of like increased, depression, increased anxiety, decreased self-worth, more social isolation, right? Fear of going out. There's some even kind of physical symptoms, somatic symptoms they're called, right? Like difficulty sleeping, more stomach aches, more headaches, right? And so they're kind of attributing these things often to what's called now racial trauma. So I thought that was interesting. And so what we were talking about, like so much of this is still coming out, right? So yeah, even though the book is based, I don't know, 70 years ago now. I still live in 2000, so I was about to say 50. But yeah, that it's still so relevant.
And I think it's really important, especially for white folks, to be of the perspective that it is trauma. That's something that we have to come to terms with, that you say racism and you're like, oh, racism, yeah. But I think if trauma from racism is something that I think white folks are still kind of chewing on, and we have to come to terms with. So Kath falls in love in the book, and I think one of my favorite parts about the book is the romance. And I'm not a romance reader at all. But I was completely absorbed by this romance. Kath falls in love, oh my gosh, I'm getting mixed up. Lily falls in love. Oh, they fall in love together, but I'm getting mixed up. Lily, the main character, and Kath, who is, I believe they have Irish ancestry, but is a white person, fall in love and have this wonderful romance. But in 1954, talking about intersectionality, these are women who are interested in women. These are young women, and they're of different races. So this brings questions about what it's like to be in an interracial relationship.
Yeah, no, I think this is a great question, and it's still a very salient question, because I do see that it's becoming so much more prolific, right? Like we see a lot of individuals, and it's very commonplace now. But I think one thing that comes to mind for me when I think about kind of interracial relationships is that I don't want people to fall prey to kind of the notion of like, well, I don't see color. Love is love. I just love them as a person. Like, it doesn't matter that they're Chinese American. I just love them as a person. If I was Kath, for example. And I think what's problematic with that kind of colorblind approach, right? Like, I don't see color. Love is love. What's problematic is that then you're not allowing yourself to see that whole person, right? In terms of like how they may have different worldviews, different cultural norms, different lived experiences, and also difference in how kind of society perceives them. So I think there's that. And then going back to kind of our first kind of discussion point, right, about intersectionality, right? And how, again, in some ways, like in this case, right, like if one person is white and one person is Chinese American, right, that there's going to be some power dynamics in terms of like how society sees each of them too. So I think it's just important to kind of be aware of that.
Yeah, and I think about, and I, in the context of the book, it makes sense, but like all those moments in the book where Kath is witnessing racism toward Lily, and not once, right? I mean, we don't know if she even understands that that's what's happening, and certainly they don't have a conversation about it. And I couldn't help but reflect on that. Like, I think to your point, Jennifer, right? The ways in which, even if you're not thinking about it, how invalidating it must be to have somebody that you love witness, right, this kind of violence toward you and not have language or ability to recognize it and just, let's say, focus on the ways in which we're alike. And just thinking about how much richer our relationships, all of our relationships, right? Like we have intimate friendships across like interracial friendships, and sort of like how much deeper those relationships can be. We can't, like as a white person, I cannot understand, right, what it is to be like the embodied experience of racism, the experience of racism. I can't ever understand that. But I think like acknowledging it just feels so incredibly important, and how much richer relationships can be when that acknowledgement can happen, that conversation can happen. And maybe even a conversation about like, what does it look like to, stand alongside somebody when they're having that experience? What do they want from us, right? Like how can we use our privilege in ways that might be useful without like stealing agency? Like all of those like really complicated conversations that like make sense. Maybe people don't have them because we aren't taught how to have them. They aren't modeled for us, but they're so important. So that's such a, I think, important point. Jennifer, like, yes, love is love. And yet, right? Like actually.
Yeah.
And that's something with their relationship. So Kath brings Lily to the Telegraph Club, which is a lesbian bar. And Lily is like, this is cool. Like, I am in this place where I see people like me. And in that same place where she finds that sort of camaraderie and community, they're also like tokenizing her as the Asian in the room. So she's experiencing this acceptance while also experiencing blatant racism at the same time. And, for whatever reason, Kath doesn't know what to do with it. Maybe, like, to your point, Nicola, maybe Kath doesn't even see it. I just bring that up to speak to the layers where somebody can feel this wonderful acceptance while still experiencing racism or prejudice. The layers are many.
Yeah, I really thank you for adding that, Jacob, because I think going back to that theme of intersectionality, and how that's so important, because it's not only about kind of like how in some ways you see yourself, but there's also how kind of others perceive you too. Like you were saying, like kind of in that day and age in that society, like she was Lily was tokenized, right? Like, oh, and that sometimes I see this too, right? Like in terms of going back to the interracial relationships, right? Someone might be like, well, I'm transracially adopted from Korea, so I actually don't know my Korean heritage or the language or anything. I know some people have said like I feel effectively white, right? But unfortunately, have then shared like how much then others around them treat them differently. Based on how they look, so I think that's just interesting. There's that aspect of both, I guess, kind of like for ourselves, and then how our social location in terms of how others in society then treat us, that looks like. But yeah, I really liked kind of what Nicola's point about kind of that how much more richer can that love be if we can kind of really know kind of the depths and understandings of all the layers of our identity and our worldviews and all of that. And it makes me think of kind of like an iceberg, right? Like when we think about culture, right? We so oftentimes think about like my kids had a cultural night, which is wonderful, by the way, not to knock it, but we talk about like the food, the different languages, the different kind of like ethnic dresses, right? Like their attire, right? But below the iceberg is all these other complex aspects, right? Like the child parent dynamic. What does that look like? What is perceived as like manners and etiquette? What is the definition of success, right? Like what's our sense of our relationship to others? All of these and so much more, right? Those are just a couple of examples of like what shapes kind of what culture looks like. So even though we're kind of talking about interracial relationships, there's also aspects of kind of like intercultural aspects too. So I think that to what you were saying about just kind of like a richer understanding. This is totally a really random anecdote, but I think it really resonated with me. The Joy Luck Club came out like 30 years ago, and it's still like sticks with me. There's like this scene, right? And those quickly write the stories about like these Chinese immigrant mothers who have Chinese immigrant daughters, and it shows them when they're younger to also when they're now mothers and that kind of thing. And so there's a scene where one of the adult daughters now have come home with their husband, I guess. So there's like a common dinner theme. And the mother, the matriarch, I guess, is like, oh, here's this dinner. I just threw it together. It doesn't taste that good. And so those of us, growing up Chinese American, we're like, oh my God, we know that, right? That's a kind of cultural norm of being very humble, try not to be like, you didn't put pressure on me to do this, so I don't want to make you feel bad. So I'm just trying to be very humble about it. But the white husband was just like, it's okay, just pour soy sauce on it. And then the horrific look on all like the other people in the family are like, oh, I just give that example. I don't know, something about what we were talking about made me think of that example, right? So again, beyond kind of even just kind of beyond the linguistic page, but just kind of understanding these nuances, these pieces, that it's an ever growing and ever evolving process too. So yeah.
That is such an amazing movie. I recently reread the book after reading it in high school. It's just a wonderful story. I'm really just popping in to say, everybody go read that book. And the fact that it really wasn't until Crazy Rich Asians was another film with an Asian cast, let alone a Chinese cast, was really ever made. That's probably 20 years in between.
Yeah, it was like 25
Craziness.
years, I think someone said.
Yes.
And I was talking to someone and they're like, I wasn't even alive when the Telegraph Club came out. I'm like, that's sad to think about, because you're like a fully functioning adult, right? You're like a 22-year-old, and you're saying like the last time like a full Asian cast came out. So going back to representation and the invisibility of the Asian race.
To be 22.
Mhm.
Speaking about community at large, where do we find community? When we find it, what does it look like? These are questions that queer people of color have been kind of wrestling with since forever. In the book, we see Lily and Kath find community at the Telegraph Club. Now, I'm somebody who's been living in Ann Arbor for the past 10 years, and there are not spaces like the Telegraph Club in Ann Arbor. And I think these spaces are disappearing more and more. So I wanted to talk to you guys about the importance of these spaces and the importance of community in general. And especially in Pride Month, when there's some are questioning, what do you need a Pride Month for? Well, I think that to foster community. So I think it's a wonderful time to talk about the role that community plays in queer people's lives and the lives of others.
Yeah, I know, right? There's like, I think there have been a number of pieces over the last year about sort of disappearing queer neighborhoods, for example. And I think, some people can think of that as like a sign of progress. And yet there might also be like great loss there. And I think also kind of, as we've been talking about throughout this whole time, there's also this sort of like reckoning of the ways in which queer spaces can be so wonderful and sources of such close connection, and yet also like not for everybody, right? And I think sort of increasingly we're having those conversations too. How do we make our communities, like not just welcoming in that like you are welcome, that I've said it must be true, but truly like inclusive spaces that really allow and create space for everybody, and sort of thinking about all of those things. But I think, like that sort of wanting to belong somewhere is such a profound and like basic need, and wanting to be surrounded by people who reflect back at us, right? The parts of ourselves that we love. And I think if you are a marginalized person in any way, because there are so few representations, like we're just talking about this, right? Like in film, on TV, et cetera, like you need community in some ways for that, right? Like that, it's such a profound piece because you're not necessarily getting it from popular culture. You're not getting it outside of these smaller spaces. And so I think that, it makes so much sense to me then that community becomes especially important. We all have this need to belong. And additionally, so if we have these marginalized identities that we're not maybe seeing affirmed in the sort of like ways in which if you're white or cis or straight, you can maybe assume you will see, right? And of course, many of us exist at various intersections, so it's kind of imperfect in that way too. But I think community is such an important part of wellness, and I think again, the book just so lovingly, in such a lovely way, highlights that tension, right? Like, here's this space and this is so exciting and thrilling and wonderful. And yet here I am being reminded again and again that I don't quite belong, like that just profound tension. So I mean, and I think this question too of is it desirable to be absorbed into the mainstream, so to speak? And like, what does that even mean? And I think increasingly, just that the HRC, right, just declared a state of emergency for LGBTQ people in the United States, right? So I think like now more than ever, having spaces of community where we can connect with other people, we can organize, we can create change, or like it's so profoundly important.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying, Nicola, about just kind of like these different aspects of community and trying to find community, right, and what that looks like. I think particularly, you know, as we were kind of talking in relation to the book, right, like in terms of Lily being kind of excited, but also kind of feeling somewhat marginalized, right, and kind of like finding this kind of queer space, right, and I think that sometimes we might feel like, okay, well, maybe I don't belong, right. And instead, like sometimes it might be about like not giving up and trying to find which community you're part of. I guess I have a two-part response to that in that sense, right? One is just like, and maybe because we work with a lot of folks with social anxiety, for example, but I find myself saying a lot, right? Like, it's okay, like, don't give up, right? It's kind of like dating in a way, right? Like, doesn't mean that you don't belong in this community. It's just maybe like you don't click with these folks, but you can try to find something else. I guess that's our privilege now in our society, right? I know that like in this time period, maybe it was like harder to find. But you know, now if you're kind of like, I'm trying to find a friend group, right? Like it's not something wrong. Sometimes it's not about it's wrong with you, right? Like maybe it's just like the folks that you're trying to run with. And I guess another piece of that too, though, right? Like I guess in a more example that I can resonate with, right? For better or for worse, there's a lot of Facebook groups, probably overwhelmingly so. But anyways, I'm just thinking about like there's an Asian Ann Arbor moms Facebook group, for example, right? And then sometimes someone might say like, oh, well, like someone said something and I must have offended someone. Maybe I'm not a mom enough, right? Like maybe I'm not doing a good enough job to be a mom, right? I think that's kind of like a parallel to maybe what Lily could have been feeling, like, oh, maybe like I don't belong in this space. However, you know, you find out that there's like all these other groups, right? There's a BIPOC moms group, there's a single moms group, there's an LGBTQ moms group, right? Because speaking to what we were saying, like there's some shared similarities, right? Like, oh yeah, motherhood, but there's some unique experiences of your motherhood as a single mom, you know, that might be different than those who co-parent, right? Or versus one that's LGBTQ or one that's a BIPOC mom in this community that we're a part of. So then it's okay to kind of keep pursuing and finding community, to kind of what Jacob and Nicola are saying. Community is so important in all aspects of our lives and our own well-being. And so it's important that we kind of encourage people to not give up on pursuing it.
This idea you're speaking to of, am I enough? Am I blank enough? It reminds me of the first big gay read 2 years ago, Aristotle and Dante discovered the secrets of the universe. But we see it again in this book where Lily, and I would even argue that more her family, are trying to figure out how to be properly American. Lily's best friend, I think the whole bit with going to the beauty pageant and what the ideal Chinese girl looks like through the lens of that beauty pageant really is, what does the ideal Chinese American girl look like? And how do I get to be the most American? So what does that even mean to be American enough? Especially as we see it in the book.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I appreciate you bringing that up, Jacob. That's such a powerful thing that I see even resonate in our society and our culture right now, right? And I guess my question back to someone who's thinking of it is just like, who's defining this, right? Like, who's defining what American looks like, right? Because likely it is kind of the centering around kind of Euro white ideals, right? Because in my mind, it's like, oh, what is American, like, especially as a Chinese American, right? And so often it's the sense of like, well, okay, well, is your name like an American sounding name, right? Like my parents probably gave me the name Jennifer so that it could sound more American, right? Or I know people who immigrate here as an adult, but they're like, oh, well, my name is Shooting. You can't pronounce it. I'll give you, is Susan more palpable for you, So is it a name? Those aspects, like even to the beauty standards, right? That's so internalized in a lot of ways, right? Like you see a lot of like Asian beauty products. It's like skin whitening creams. I'm like, oh my goodness. That's kind of perceived as beauty, right? It's kind of like the kind of how we position us in proximity to whiteness. But yeah, I remember thinking back to kind of the first big gay read when we had that question, because I think that as we think about this, right, there is really no comparison. It's not like there's a litmus test of like how American you are. I don't introduce myself as like, well, like 10 years ago, I was like 30% American, but now I'm like 70% American. So yeah, I think it's kind of like questioning that kind of should commentary, and kind of embracing who we are, right? Because in the very fabric of like American, we talk about it. It used to be called a melting pot, right? It's different now, but even then, right? Like that concept of like, yeah, if we're American, it should be embraced and celebrated for its diversity. And then, yeah, on the flip side, again, seeing as someone who's like identify as Chinese American, I see then people then questioning like, well, am I Chinese enough? And that's, I know we use the term marginalized in a different way, but that's also kind of a form of marginalization where a lot of folks are like, well, am I too white amongst my Chinese American friends, but I'm too Asian amongst my white friends? How do I kind of like reconcile this? And I've seen that even recently, right? Like anecdotally speaking, again, right, thinking about like the Lunar New Year, right? Chinese culture customs are like you kind of hang up these like what's called couplets, so like these banners with these beautiful, Chinese, poetic kind of well wishes. So anyone that walks through your door, they're greeted with these well wishes. But it's just like something that you visually see a lot in celebration to this holiday. And some people feel like, well, I don't feel like am I Chinese enough because I can't even read it, right? And that speaks to kind of another theme of this what's called the Asian diaspora, right? Like because kind of the immigrant experience, again, trying to become more American. Some folks felt like they didn't want their kids speaking their native language at home, and so they kind of lost speaking it or being able to read it. And so to all of this to say is like, what is enough? It's like kind of going back to kind of like how you embrace yourself, and that's okay, right? We're not going to compare ourselves to anybody else. That's my 2 cents anyway.
And the folks who are wrestling with this question of am I American enough, more likely or not, they're going to be children of immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering from your perspective, what is that experience like? What about Lily's experience in the book stuck out to you? That's something that I think we definitely, when talking about this book, we got to touch on.
Yeah. I think that is a common thing that I've seen a lot. Again, maybe because it's my own personal circles that I run in, and I think that there's a lot of themes as well as a lot of diversity in terms of what that looks like to be a child of an immigrant. A common theme that we see with Lily, I think that again still resonates even now, right? Is that like the immigrant parents, their main focus is just trying to survive. And it just feels like there's such a thin and narrow path as to what that looks like. And there's, again, the fear of safety, fear of rejection, really trying to figure out like how do we survive in this country? How do we help our child succeed? Would be some of the kind of the themes that I've seen both in the book and in folks that I've talked with, and I know both professionally and personally, like a couple of examples, I guess, is that like, especially like Chinese Americans, not always the case, but one common example I've heard for some folks, right, is that being a Chinese immigrant, they had to be thrusted into these interesting roles where they're kind of acting as translators at the age of like, kindergarten, first grade or whatever. They're trying to like translate for their parents, like, this is my homework, or this is a prohibition slip. Can you help cite it? And then speaking to like different cultural norms and values, right? Like things that like maybe weren't customs to schools that they're used to, and trying to kind of educate their parents on what that looks like to them. So I've seen that as a theme too of children of immigrants. One person joked, I remember they were saying like, we had to learn to be able to kind of speak our minds, because at the age of 7, I had to talk to the McDonald's, fast food person and tell them what I want to order. But yeah, and all joking aside, like, I think that there's those aspects. I've seen, some themes, for example, where people will joke, right? Like as an Asian American, so oftentimes the immigrant parents are like, you have only these 3 choices as career paths. You have to be a doctor, you have to be an engineer, I don't even know what the other one is, mostly doctor and engineer, right? And we all joke like, oh my God, I can't believe our parents were so strict with that. But now, again, being an adult child of immigrants, kind of being able to understand like a lot of that is because of their fear of what survival looked like in this country, that they feel like in a country where they're discriminated against, right? They're like, the only way I see that path where our child has stability is through education, to kind of get a career that they can hopefully have that stability, financial stability, and hopefully some respect. So yeah, those are some of the things that I've seen even on amongst particularly Asian Americans. However, I guess I wanted to just kind of like qualify that with like, there's just so much diversity. When I first kind of heard the question, I was just thinking like, if you met a child of an immigrant, you met a child of an immigrant, in the sense of like, there's just so much variety, right? There's not something where we can kind of really succinctly summarize, right? Because like how they came to this country, right? Did they come here as a refugee status, like genocide, or are they coming here on an academic visa? Is going to be quite different. When did they come to this country, right? What time period? What was going on in history? Where did they go to? Did they go, to an ethnic enclave? Did they go to like rural, Nebraska? All these things, I can kind of shape that immigrant experience. I mean, the child of immigrant experience in those contexts. And someone once even shared with me that they're kind of coming into kind of explore more of their transracial Korean adoptee identity. And they were saying like, they are kind of coming to find that, they meet even other Korean adoptees, that there's such a difference, like those who were adopted in the 1970s versus those adopted in the 80s versus those who were adopted in the 90s, have very, very different kinds of experiences, both in terms of like how the nature of their adoption and also the nature of how they grew up in this country. So.
I think the one other thing I would add, and I think we see this in the book too, and you touch on this, Jennifer, is that question of like sort of the weight of expectations, right? And I think, the book in some ways like highlights that so well, because there's this really dangerous moment that they're living in. And I think especially, as Lily is navigating everything, but especially coming out, I think we can kind of see the ways in which her coming out makes her in some ways like less American, right? She's even more transgressive, and already her family is experiencing like just how precarious their position is because of racism. And I think this also highlights, right, like one of the sort of complexities of the model minority myth, which is like, you better really behave, right? Because if you don't behave, you're not living up to this. Like, we've given you this very particular, again, precarious set of privileges. And so I think that's something that the book really shows very nicely, is both like, and in a really dramatic way, of course, because of everything that's going on, but it's just what it's like to inherit a whole set of expectations, and then also kind of constantly have to be some representative, right? That everything you do is reflecting on your community in a particular way. And so, of course, there's something very unique about that like her particular story. And then I think maybe many of us can resonate with that idea of like what it looks like to represent your family, or your community. And that like that sort of, you have to be both a good cultural representation and a good American, right? Like you've got double duty in some ways. And
in this list of prescribed privileges and rules, I think throughout the book, we see Lily kind of buck them in a way that's really empowering. Just by the act of coming out to her family, just pretty much everything she does is a transgressive act, whether that be against her parents' Chinese values, the information she's being fed at school and through culture about what it is to be American, and even what she's learning from other queer women in these queer spaces. She's always kind of like, yeah, but no, or this is what's for me, or this is how I like, this is where I fit into there. Which was really incredible to read. And for many reasons, that's one where you really fall in love with Lily. Now, speaking about the ending of the book, which spoilers, I have been kind of trained that in these sorts of queer stories, and particularly romance stories, there's going to be a tragic ending. Somebody's going to die. That's how these things have, those are the kinds of stories that we've really been fed quite a bit over these decades. So when the ending, which of course has its tragedy as well, Lily is sent to live with her aunt because her parents reject her. And her mother, I'm paraphrasing here, basically says, my daughter couldn't do that. My daughter couldn't be attracted to other women. There's just no way. But her aunt seems really cool. Her aunt seems really cool. That's beyond the point. What I want to use this opportunity to talk about are people who are asked to leave their home because of their gender identity, because of their sexuality. And these are young people. These are people, teenagers, preteens. This is something that we American queer people experience, and they are kicked out on the street. Not everybody has a really cool rocket scientist aunt who you can move into their home and do cool stuff. That experience is definitely the exception. I would like to take this time to discuss, if you are in that situation where you've been kicked out of your home because of your identity, because of your sexual identity, your gender identity, I was hoping to hear from trained professionals what advice, and advice seems so small, that word seems small. What would you have to offer somebody who is in that experience?
wow, I'm not sure I feel up to the task of like offering succinct and useful advice in the
Absolutely.
moment. But I think, things that come up for me sort of thinking about and having worked with and having friends, right? Like who've had that experience and sort of thinking about the aftermath, and my own experience, which was certainly not so extreme, but, I think, of course, the two pieces that probably really emerge for a lot of people and that really resonate, right? It's like a wound and it doesn't always fully heal. And I think sort of those questions then of like being able to really, as painful as it is, get in touch with that sense of rejection and shame. Because in part, right, when we don't, I think, connect to, honor, and like, I hate the term work through because it sort of implies some kind of resolution that I'm not sure is always possible. But if we don't acknowledge and figure out ways to hold to those feelings, I think that they can just show up in all different ways in our lives that we might not want them to. So I think like that is, from a sort of mental health, this is what I'm speaking to, right? Like I think in the moment, right, I'm not sure that I have great thoughts, but I think long-term, being able to like acknowledge and get in touch with those feelings of rejection and shame are really, really important. And then the other thing I think about is, we talk so much now. I think we've really developed a very strong understanding of like the importance of our attachment, right? In dictating, again, so much of our mental health and how we relate to other people, how we form connection. And of course, we're talking about, this is why community is so important too, right? Like if you're going to be potentially rejected by your community of origin. Having, so I think like I oftentimes work with clients on things like self-attachment, but I'm also a really big, I think we need other people. So I think it is understanding your own sort of being secure in yourself is really important. And it's a strong foundation to make connections with other people. I guess I want to reflect too. I mean, I think is it okay I was like, the word that comes to mind for Lily, she's like such a badass, right? Like, I hope it's okay to swear here. She is such a badass, and I guess what I would say is one of the things, the story is actually quite hopeful because, and this speaks to this question of like journey. She actually does go home. You see her at the end. She's at home with her mom. So I agree that there's this moment of rejection, and yet I want to, and I'm not in a Pollyannish way, but like, there really is a journey there too. And I think she refuses to lie to her family, and yet she's with them, right? Like, and I love that the book allows for that possibility, because I think we live in this moment where understandably, sometimes that's not possible. And you have to make a cut from your family. And that is profoundly difficult. Some people don't experience it as difficult. They just experience it as necessary. And they, I think, but maybe this is like this probably like a lot of my own cultural assumptions, but I think for many of us, figuring out how to be in some kind of relation with our family feels important, right? Like even our chosen families sometimes can betray us in really profound ways. And that, I think, is something really hopeful that the book offers, which is this idea that like, it might not be perfect. It may never be quite what you need, which is why you need like an awesome aunt and uncle who, find other parts of your identity. Because I don't know that they're very accepting of her sort of lesbian or queer identity. But I am all about holding those dialectics, right? Like that there can sometimes be ways to be in relation with people who don't fully understand us. And that's like really difficult, and we need lots of support, and we need the people who understand us. But I think I don't see it as a full break. And I have this like imagined world where they like, I don't know that they figure it out, and that Lily's mom is ever going to be like, awesome, I'm so excited that you're a lesbian or whatever, but that they have a connection still, that isn't gone. And I agree, she creates this like, you can't be a lesbian and be a part of our family. And yet that actually isn't quite what she lives, right? And so I think there's also that like family can say all kinds of things. People can say all kinds of things in the moment. And that's why I think that idea of longevity and I hope that I don't sound like I'm downplaying the very real way in which people are, in fact, rendered homeless and kicked out of their families. That absolutely happens. I think in the book, there's some complexity there.
Yeah. No, I'm so glad, Jacob, for you raising this question, because it is something that a lot of folks may have to or do experience, and so I'm glad we're kind of touching upon it. And this by no means is meant to kind of like glaze over it or minimize it or whatnot, because it can be so challenging and profoundly difficult. But kind of like what I hear Nicola kind of sharing, right? I think that there is a sense that sometimes it can be, I don't know, obviously we don't know for sure, but I think sometimes kind of like what we say and what we do aren't actually kind of in sync in that way. Like as you're recounting the end of the book, right? And like her mom is verbally saying like, you don't belong in this family. And then she kind of creates this action. I think our mind immediately thinks like, well, her action is because she's rejecting her, which could be true. But I think kind of from kind of these Chinese immigrant understanding, and I had a possible other kind of perspective that I just wanted to throw out there, again, not to minimize the possibility of rejection, but possibly this other way of perceiving the situation. And I've seen these themes come up again now that we're like adult children of immigrants. So we're kind of always kind of joking about like how our parents have acted, and now are now understanding of what that meant, right? And so often amongst like Asian Americans, we'll say like, our parents never said the word "I love you." I've never heard them say "I love you." They never physically hugged or anything, right? But it's always through actions. So now again, in a more silly way, they'll say like, have you eaten yet? Have you, if they come over and be like, here's all this leftovers I want you to take home, right? Because they don't know how to express love verbally, but it's through the actions of the, like, I want to care for you. I want to take care, make sure you're taken care of, you're well fed. And so in a more serious way, I wonder if like Lily's parents are kind of sending her off to go live with this auntie, which sounds like really resonates with her, right? Like science, right? All of that is somehow their way of wanting to like protect her. Or even if it's like something like Nicola was saying, like could be their journey, they're still kind of grappling with it, but they probably are coming from a place of already kind of being scared and being rejected into society as Chinese immigrants, right? But now there's this other layer of another identity that they're not really sure how to wrap their mind around, and are kind of concerned as a society, how she will be accepted. And so, maybe for them, they're like, this is for your safety. Is perhaps why they might have sent her away. So that was kind of a thought that kind of came to my mind. It's like maybe there's that aspect to it.
Yes, in Lily's situation, I think is unique. But a thought I had listening to your response to that question is that when a queer person is kicked out of their home, or when a queer person lives in a home where they are abused, more often than not, that queer person has to understand where their oppressors are coming from. And that is a huge burden and a huge ask. Because the reason why we're getting kicked out is because our family refuses to understand us. But for us to come to terms with them, we have to go, oh, they kicked me out because they thought they were doing the right thing for me, or whatever it might be. And there's just so much mental labor that I think that marginalized groups have to do, invisible mental labor that cannot be fathomed by others. It's overwhelming.
No, such a good point, right? It's just, yeah, even though, I share this perspective, like in it, it's heavy, right? I mean, it's too much to kind of expect them to kind of in the moment see that, right? Like, that's why I'm even saying, like, in these kind of more innocuous kind of examples, only as an adult can we look back and see these things. And in Lily's case, who knows what will happen as an adult, right? Doesn't mean that just because you understand the intent doesn't mean that it doesn't hurt you and that you felt abandoned and that maybe you don't want to repair the relationship, But yeah, I appreciate you adding that point, Jacob. That is just such an emotional labor and challenge to be already kind of in this situation of abandonment and then having to figure out what that looks like. Or what that means.
Yeah, I think that's where some of those dialect, right? Like understanding is not the same as saying it's not the same as saying it's not the same as excusing, right? You can understand.
Oh my gosh.
And I think you are right. Like, I mean, we've, in feminist theory, we talk about like situated knowledge, right? And sort of thinking about like where we are situated. Sorry, like really abstract here, but like where we're sort of located informs what we can know about the world. And I think in some ways it is true to a certain extent that marginalized people will always know more about the world because, in fact, to survive, you have to, in some ways, like in some ways, it's like such profound empathy that you have to develop because it is, in fact, a survival skill to be able to sort of think about and understand and figure out. But thinking about and understanding and figuring out is not the same thing as saying that's right, that's just, right? And in some ways, in fact, we can't move towards that like more hopeful place of change without understanding some of the things that went wrong or that were not okay or that were, and so I think some people understandably, right? Like you can, if you're kicked out of your family and there's no way home, there's no way home. You have to go make a home somewhere else. And I think the book sort of offers this vision where maybe there is a home and Lily refuses to, she sort of says, right? She like refuses to lie. Although I think at the end, she doesn't tell her parents when she goes to see Kath, right? So it's like this sort of I think it really illustrates those complexities that happen when we remain in relation. And of course, it's also really complicated. I think the thing that is also complicated for LGBTQ people around rejection from your family is that, like, we have such strong cultural norms. They look different depending on what culture you are, but around the meaning of family. And so, in fact, it's kind of different to be rejected by the people who you are expected to raise you and care for you and love you unconditionally, although we can all like unpack that in lots of ways, than maybe to be rejected by people who are not your family. So I think there's all kinds of like complicated pieces there for sure. But yeah, you're right. It is a really big ask. And I don't know that, I think like therapeutically, it's not like a client comes in and that's where you start, right? Like at all, right? Like where you start is, and that's where I started. You start by honoring that shame that comes up and that rejection and like holding that, because I think, yeah.
Oh, and just to be able to say somebody I love did something awful to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like that's like a huge thing to come to terms with, I in my opinion. But, and I'm very excited to say this, I have not read it yet, but if you would like to know how the story of Kath and Lily unfolds, you could check out the companion novel by Malinda Lo called A Scatter of Light. It is not a direct sequel. It is a companion novel, which I understand centers around the 2011 gay marriage Supreme Court decision. And there's two young people and their paths cross with Lily's. So it's the kind of thing where like characters from the first book you see in this book, they might not be main characters, but you're like, that's my old friend type of thing. So A Scatter of Light. And also, please come to on June 20th. And this video comes out after June 20th. So what am I even saying? But but come see Malinda Lo talk. We are so excited to host her, and I'm just excited to meet her. We've been talking so much about her. It's like now we get to meet. So with all that being said, check out A Scatter of Light. Check out all the wonderful events for Pride Month at the library in June and beyond. We're doing gay stuff every month. And we're so happy for that. And we're also so happy for the time and effort and the wisdom and conversation that we just shared with our friends from Everwell Counseling. So thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Nicola, so much.
Thank you.